Hi guys, welcome to the stream today. Yeah, so I'm going to be taking you on backend engineering, our backend engineering class. So we'll be looking at Express. We'll be looking at introduction to building APIs. I'm sure we have covered a couple of things in the previous class, right? But this time around, we are also going to go full hands-on. I can see some of the messages coming in. Okay. All right. Hi, Promise. Hi, Oluwafemi. Hello. That's Benai here, right? How are you doing today? Okay. So just let me know in the chat once you can see my screen, guys. All right. Let me know in the chat once you can see my screen. Let me see. Okay, a second. Oh, okay. Not yet. I'm sharing now. Please confirm if you can see my screen. Okay. Um, I need to close a couple of these things here. All right, so let's just jump into xcalidraw.com. I'll do a very quick intro again, right? I know we have actually covered some of this before. All right, thank you. Thank you, Abdul Salam. So I am going to take off so we can have enough space. I want us to have enough space on the screen. Okay, I think this works. Yeah. All right, let's keep it this way. Okay, so what we're going to do is first try to understand try to understand some of these, details when it comes to backend engineering. Some of the things that I expect you guys to know. Of course, we've covered some of these things already. That is why I say, I expect you guys to know them already. Okay. So the first thing here would be, REST, and I'm sure this was actually explained to you in the previous class. HTTP. So I'm going to move pretty fast, but of course, if you have questions while I explain, do well to ask your questions in the chat. All right. Um, Sorry, someone said, is that a screen not found error? Okay, so I hope you can see my screen anyways. So I have rest right here. So this means representational, I think representation, what is it? Representational state transfer. Okay. Hypertext transfer protocol. And some of the HTTP codes, we are really going to look at some of these things, like 200, right? 400 and more. So we have different, families when it comes to these HTTP codes, right? I'm just going to say S, just to make you understand. We have, they are basically in these categories, right? And I'll show you how to also get access to, materials that can guide you if you're trying to understand, the meaning of these HTTP codes. You don't need to cram them. You don't need to memorize them. With time, you'll basically get used to it. Okay. All right. So when we talk about REST, I'm going to keep this, very high level. I just want you to understand the concept here, right? When we talk about REST, we're basically talking about, how you transfer data, from one service to another service, how you communicate, between services, right? Services can be your interface, right? Maybe your, let's call it the UI. So say you build an application, right? Let's call this application 300devdays.com. Okay, and you are basically trying to communicate with an API service. Maybe we'll call it api.300devdays.com, and we'll call this the backend API. All right. So if you take a look at this right now, we have the website. So let's say the website UI. Okay. When you visit 300devdays.com on your browser, it's going to take you to a particular page. That is the page we're assuming we have here. And the backend for that page is simply the engine that powers some of the actions, right? So the communication then, happens between this, service and the backend. So which means we can simply have an arrow pointing this way. We basically make a call. So let's just say we make API call, right? And then we are going to receive a response. Okay, so this is uh, a request response, pattern. So we'll make a request to the server, and we'll get response. Most likely a JSON response object, right? Depending on what you're trying to do, but I'm just trying to make you understand, what that communication looks like, right? You have the front end communicate to the back end. We'll make an API call. This API call can, be either of the actions. We have gets, right? We have posts, we have puts, we have get, right? We have even patch, okay? Yes, and this was also explained in the previous session that you guys had as well. So as I mentioned earlier, we're taking this high level, of course, right? These are called HTTP verbs, okay? These are called HTTP verbs, right? So when you hear HTTP verbs, this is what they are referring to, okay? These are the verbs, the actions you are trying to, trigger, right? Just keep that in mind. The actions that we're trying to trigger here. So these are they are called the HTTP verbs. All right. Now back to this. This is our backend. Remember that, okay? And now this is our UI. So let's just keep it this way. When you make a call, an API call, it's either of these options. Let's just assume that our API call here is, we're trying to say slash submit, right? We're making a call to the endpoint slash submit. Okay. Now, I think I've mentioned something else, and I want to make sure that, I use some of these terms so that you guys can also get familiar with them, right? So I said endpoint. When you are making a call to your API, we refer to these yeah, give me a minute. Let's just arrange this properly. So we refer to these, these parts that you are visiting. We refer to them as, resources, right? So basically, these are also the endpoints. The idea is you have a function somewhere or a method somewhere in your backend, right? Let's just call this function get. Yeah, let's just call it, submit record. Okay. So this is a function you have sitting somewhere in your backend. So have request, response, and I would simply say return hello world. Okay, or I would just say return response or send hello world, just to keep it familiar for those of you that understand um, JavaScript. I believe most of us here are already familiar with JavaScript. If you're not familiar with JavaScript, please make sure you go back and take some of the videos that we've taught already, right? When it comes to learning how to program with JavaScript. Okay, so I'm simply going to refer to this here as the endpoint that we decide to visit. It's called an endpoint because you basically have a route on that path, right? So if you visit this particular route, um, it's going to then trigger a function or a method that you have on the back end. All right. So we're just assuming that this is the function, and when you call this, it's going to call this guy. Of course, this function can cascade into performing a lot of actions, but the point is you actually have a communication happening here. All right. So just to ensure that you get the big picture here, this is the endpoint, and let's call this the resource. Okay. So that is the resource, and then this is the endpoints. All right. So hope that makes sense. And you are going to be making this call from the UI, right? Or it can be a different service. So you can have service to service interaction. You can have, client to service interaction. There are different ways. At the end of the day, the point is you are trying to, send a request, and you also expect to get a response. When we are sending this, what you pass in as an object or as data is what we refer to as the payload. All right. So I want to keep this. Yeah, let's have enough space to show this visualization. So we have the endpoint, and then what will pass on that endpoint is the payload. So I'll give an example. We want to submit a form, and this form would contain our email and password. All right. So let's have our email and password right here. Email, this is an object. and I say me at solomonmarvel.com, that is my email, right? Just showing you an example here. So that is the email we want to use. And then we have the password, and I'll just say password 12345. Okay. Now that is the password. This object you see right here is referred to as a JSON object, right? And it is the payload. It is what we are sending to the backend, right? So let's call it the JSON payload. All right. If you don't know what JSON stands for, JSON stands for JavaScript Objects Notation. All right. JSON stands for JavaScript Objects Notation. All right, let's make some space. This is the JSON payload, and this is what you are going to send when you call this slash submit. Now, this is going to be like, a regular path. So you have maybe like localhost. Okay, since we're looking at this API right now, let's stick to, this URL. So this would basically appear this way slash submit. So if you look at this right now, you see we have a URI, right? So let's say HTTPS. So you have API slash 300 dev days, .com slash submit, right? That is the endpoint, okay? And then you have the payload that goes alongside the endpoint, right? You have that payload. You want to send a JSON payload. I mean, you have to specify what should my payload look like. In this example, we are saying our payload is going to be a JSON payload, and JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Okay, I hope this is making sense, guys. I want everybody to be carried along. And the resource we end up calling sitting on the back end right here, is going to be this function, for example. Okay, it can be something else. If it's a sign up, payload, then maybe we can just have, sign up. Let's make this, even clearer. Okay, so sign up. So we are trying to sign up from the front end. We pass our payload, which is this, item. And then on the back end here, we have the resource. And this resource says, sign up. It can be an asynchronous function if that is what you want to do, right? And within this function, you can basically, you can basically decide to get the payload. And I will show you that with actual code. But, you can basically decide to get the payload. So we can simply say request.body, and we can just have maybe const username and password. So yes, if you are familiar with JavaScript, then yes, I believe you understand what we are doing right here. Okay, so this is going to give us that value, and we can decide to just return a simple message that says sign up successful. All right. So just to come back, let's circle back a bit so that we don't you know we don't end up confused. What we're trying to show is what that communication look like. We're making an API call and we're following a standard, which is the REST standard. Okay. When we're following the REST standard, we have our action look this way. The endpoint. This is the endpoint we're calling to sign up. We are sending a JSON payload because we want our object to be a JSON object, right? There are different ways to communicate with your backend. You can choose to use the option called multipath, right? But for now, we are just using JSON. In the past, we used what we call XML, but in more modern software engineering practice, we stick to the JSON, standard. And of course, there are other patterns, but JSON is pretty much, widely used. Then, when that payload gets to the backend, what we are calling is a resource on the backend, and this is that resource, right? In this case, a function. That function will basically execute the code while probably working with the data that we sent, in the payload, right? This happens via HTTP. Okay, so HTTP is the protocol that we are using to perform this action, right? So you can see we have HTTP right here, hypertext transfer protocol. Sometimes you also get to see HTTPS, which is a secured, it's a secure way of sending data, right? Of course, over the internet. And yeah, HTTPS simply says, okay, you are secured, right? You have put additional measures into ensuring that you have an additional level of security, right? Which means the data that is being sent and received over that, um, over that website, over that API, over that server is basically secure, right, and encrypted. Okay. Yeah. So this is basically what the structure looks like for the HTTP verbs. We have different options here. We have more than this, but this is pretty much the standard convention that we have out there, the standard verbs that are I would say mostly used, right, widely used. So this is simply to fetch items. Now, the funny thing is you can actually use them interchangeably, right? But it makes sense to follow the standard so that at the end of the day, if you have a different developer looking at your code, they understand what you are trying to do with that specific action and you don't end up confusing people, right? So the get action is going to, basically you're going to find yourself using it most times to perform find or get, request, right? Post, this will be used to create. Okay. Maybe you have heard of what we call CRUD, right? Um, yeah. So let's just follow that, convention. So get will be used to read, let's say read data, while post is used to create data. So this is where the C comes in, right? R for this option. So that's create read. Okay. And let's point at this. So then we also have the U, which is used to update data. And either of these options can be used, to update, put, right, or patch. So most times the way people tend to think about this is when they use put, they are basically trying to update every single thing in that existing data, right? Which means they are sending the full object. The thing is, put can be used in place of patch, patch can be used in place of put, even post can be used to achieve the function of put, patch, delete, or even get, right? You can use either of them, but you shouldn't, right? The fact that you can use it doesn't mean you should. You need to make sure you have clean code. You need to make sure you have clean code out there so that people can easily understand what you're trying to achieve. Imagine having a delete action that gets or reads data, right, or fetches data. It doesn't make sense. Okay, so it's good to follow some standards. All right, and of course, delete. Yeah, so I said put is mostly used when people probably want to just update like majority of the record, probably sometimes even all of them. You just want to replace what you have there. Patch is used mostly when you want to just patch a specific portion of the data you have, right? Maybe you have a lot of data, you just want to update um, probably one field, right, or two fields. But at the end of the day, people use them interchangeably, and you can use put or patch in place of performing that update, right? So deleting data, you use the delete action, okay, and you don't need to. This is not as complex as it might seem. If you work with Postman, as you can see, I have Postman opened up right here. Let me zoom in a bit. Um, yeah, so as you can see, I have Postman opened up right here. I can choose to create a new collection. Let's call this 300 dev days, for example. So Postman is basically a tool that you can use for performing API requests. Okay, so from creating a collection, you see when I click on add request, it gives me this option where I can now specify, what exactly do I want. You see, I have get, post, put, patch, delete. You see, I have a lot of them here, and I can choose to select what I want, put in that URL, which is basically what we have, right here. So we can put in that URL. Okay, so that URL is what we put in here. And we can, of course, put the JSON object, which is what I call the payload, in the body section. We are going to have a different section to actually explain Postman, right? So we can basically put that in here. Okay. Um, right. And I said password. Okay, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so we can basically have something like this, which is exactly what I have mentioned here, right? But let's not dive so deep into Postman. We're going to get back to that, later, right? So for now, I just hope you understand some of the things I've explained. If you have any questions, do well to drop it in the chat. Let's talk about the status code thing here. When you send requests to the backend, when the request gets to this backend and it gets to that resource, you want to perform an action and then you want to respond by telling the person or the service that, oh, I received your request, I've done this, and this is what I think, this is where I think we're at right now. This is the state of things, right? The status is simply the status code or the HTTP code right here is simply telling us, the situation of things. If the request was successful, you're probably going to come back to tell us, oh, uh, I'm sending back a 200, right? What is the status of my request, right? So let's say we have this guy right here. Yeah, so we have this guy right here, and yeah, sometimes I just like to probably sketch myself out somewhere. So we have a stick figure, right? And then this person, makes a request from the UI. So this person makes a request from the UI. This is the UI right here. And when this request goes from the UI to a backend system, you also expect a response. I expect that, you will be expecting a response, right? So the status codes that we have would make us understand what the response should look like. Okay, so if we get a response, we say sign up, right? And then from the back end, it basically calls the sign up function. On the front end, we simply click on that, right? We put the credential that we need to use for signing up. On the back end, it probably receives that credential, and the first thing it wants to do is, check the database, right? So let's say MongoDB database. So it checks that database, and it was able to see an existing record, right? So it saw an existing record with exactly the same email, and of course that should not be accepted, right? Then it comes back to you to say, oh, I realize that that record already exists, right? So if that record already exists, let's just say create record, create new record. So this is the action that was sent to the DB. I want to create a new record, and then it comes back to say that record already exists. Okay, and then since it returns that this record already exists, your sign up function now was able to see that, oh, there was an error, right? So it throws an error to say this particular record already exists. So what we're going to do right now is that we need to tell this guy that this record already exists. We can send what we call um, our response object, right? And now the response object might look, something like this. So our response might look like this. We have like error, or we have status failed. So this action actually, it failed to perform this action successfully, right? It's just an example, by the way. You can choose to, structure this the best way you think, works for you and your team, of course, when you start working on something. And it says, message, we have a message. So what is the message? The message says record already exists. Now, of course, a lot of people would also include the status code in here. I don't even think that's necessary. The status code is usually outside of this response object, right? So you have status code. This status code would say maybe 409. If I'm not mistaken, 409 would mean conflicts. Yeah, I just want to be sure, but I'll probably check. So you can easily check status code 409. And if you check the Mozilla, yeah, so you see this says that there's a conflict, right? When you're trying to create a new resource. But let's just go straight to the Mozilla developer network, and I'll say HTTP status codes. Okay, so I have that right here. And yeah, so if you also check the charts, right, you would find that link shared in the chat, so you can simply copy that. You see we have different, categories. All right, I'll come back to this shortly. But the point is, we're able to send the status code, and the client or the server that is, making this request would be able to know that, oh, with this particular code, something already exists, right? So these codes are, pretty much standards that the front-end developer and the back-end developer would use to understand the situation of things, even without necessarily going through this, feedback, right? You already have the status. This failed. It was not successful. So on your front end, you can simply say, okay, let's check the status. If it was successful, probably what you would find yourself doing most times is to say, if it was successful, give us, this item that says success, right? And if it wasn't successful, give us this item that says failed, right? You would find yourself doing this most times. But the point is, you are able to easily check, success, the status, and you can have maybe, true or false if you prefer to go that way, right? So you can have true or false. It makes it easier for you as well. So this, at this point, this is, a boolean, right? And it's easy to just check. So if you just check, maybe we call this data or response, so it's easy to just check, right? As a JavaScript developer, if you are saying response dot, status, this gives you true, right? If this is true, obviously, and if it's false, then of course, you get false, right? So if it's true, of course, you get true, and then it's easier to use this for, your conditionals to determine what to present. Possibly, you want to also say, I have a message record already exists, right? So you can just grab that message from here, rather than having the front end guys depend on, their own understanding of the error. You can also give them a detailed understanding of the error in that response. But the point is, with the status code, you can easily identify what exactly happened without necessarily looking at the response. Let's go back to this HTTP response code. If you take a look at what we have here, you see we have different categories: informational responses from 100 to 199. We have successful responses from 200 to 299. We have redirection messages from 300 to 399. We have client error responses from 400 to 499. And we have server error responses from 500 to 599. So you guys can go through this material later, but some of the important ones you would probably find yourself saying would be 200, which means okay. When you create a new record, for example, you would prefer to use 201 rather than 200, because 201 means created. It means the request was successful and the data was created, right? If you can return, some of these responses here. I mean, everything here is a success response, basically, right? When you get to redirection, you get to see some of these. We have moved permanently, like 301. If any of you have tried to maybe access Google from Postman, you might have seen that, right? If I say HTTPS google.com, for example, without the payload, so let's say none. If I send this request, what you would probably see would be most times you get a redirection error, but let's see what we get here. Www.google.com. Okay, so that basically gives, let's look at the preview. Okay. Okay, so I think this is actually redirecting within Postman. Probably I would check this from the terminal. But yeah, I mean, sometimes you try to visit a particular page and maybe they set a redirection rule. It redirects from that particular domain, or to a different subdomain, right? You get to see how that redirection rule is being displayed. So if I say call, I'm not very sure if it's when you go to google.com or when you go to oh yeah, I think it's when you go to google.com. So if you take a look at what we have here, you see we have a status code that says 301 moved, right? Which means this page has been moved permanently to www dot, right? So whenever you visit google.com on your browser, it's going to push it's going to navigate you to this domain, right? www.first. Okay, so you might have not noticed that before, but if we try it right now, let's say we go to https google.com and we press enter. Now you see it has moved us to www. Right? That is 301. Yeah, that is 301 in action, right? That is the response we get from there. So it moves it automatically, and the code you get is 301 moved permanently to a different subdomain. All right, so you see we have a bunch of others. If you get to the client side error, the client error response, you get to see some error messages like 400 bad requests. So you are trying to create a record, for example, and you send an object that the backend is not going to use. The backend is not in conformity with that record that you sent. That is not what they expect. That is not what they want. They can return an error message to you saying that maybe a particular item is not found on the record or the object you sent, and they can also decide to just send these 400 status code as well to tell you that, oh, we can't process this because this is not what we're expecting, right? So the object you sent is malformed. It's not what we are expecting to use, right? If someone is trying to access a resource and they are not authorized, this is probably what you want to use. 401, you are unauthorized. Okay? If you require payments, 402, payment required. If they are trying to access something that they don't have permission to access, you send a 403, which says forbidden. If they're trying to access a resource that doesn't exist, then you probably want to give them a 404, right? If we go back to Postman, for example, and I try to access something like google.com/hello world, if this doesn't exist, we're going to get a 404. As you can see, we have a 404 not found. This is an error, and this was not found on the server. Okay, let's go back to that again. So you see we have a lot of them: not accepted, not acceptable, method not allowed, request timed out, conflict, right? Gone. There are so many of them, and when you understand each of these error messages, it makes your backend implementation, better, right? I mean, developers would love this. It will be good for business. It will be good for your engineering team because you have given them a clear description of the standards to follow, right? If you have a server error, you don't know what the error is. It's most times better to just send a 500, which says we have an internal error on the server. It's our fault, not your fault. Okay, so 500 is a good one in such scenarios. We have a lot of others. So I would advise you actually come to this page, look through this page, and learn about the error, learn about the HTTP response status codes. Okay, so it's time for us to write some code. I hope this explanation was good enough for some of you. If you have more questions, drop it in the chat before we jump into writing code. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Tell me if this is um, if you understand what I've explained so far. If you have questions, if it's not clear, point out where you are having challenges, right, from the explanation I've given before we jump into writing code. I'm giving you 2 minutes. Drop your questions in the chat so I can take them before we proceed. All right. All right, so I don't think we have any questions. I think we can actually proceed then. Um, yeah, it seems like we're all, familiar with some of the explanations I've given, and I believe we are good to go. So let's jump into writing code. I have prepared a material I will share with you, right? But for those of you that were not in the previous session that I had, I will show you how to set up your backend. I mean, using Node.js basically, right, and JavaScript. So let's start off with setting up that environment. I'm going to pull up the terminal. Let's quit these other options I have opened up here. So let's terminate this. Okay. What I have to do, take this off. All right. Zoom in. Make sure everybody can see this. Hello world. All right. I think that's big enough. Clear? Okay, guys. So we're going to set up our uh, we're going to set up our backend environment, our Node.js environment for our backend code. All right. Let's start by creating a folder on the desktop. So I am simply, let's switch to this NU guy thing. So yeah, okay. So let's say we have mkdir arrow. So I'm going to make a new folder here. Let's call it Node.js backend. Okay. So we're going to open the Node.js backend. So right now, we have an empty folder. I'm simply going to create a new file. I can call this server.js, right? Because we're using JavaScript here, of course, okay? So I call this Java server.js, and I can proceed to, you see we have a single file here, right? So we can start by saying npm init-y, or we can just follow the prompt that we get. So it says, what do we have here? npm executable was not found. Okay, so I think it's because we are using nu. So let's go back again and try that one more time. npm init. Okay. Yeah, so that was because of the shell I simply tuned into. So right now we're trying to create a new Node.js application. So for the package name, let's leave some of these defaults, right? Let's leave the defaults. Author, I'll just say magic. All right. Yes, this is okay. And now we have our package.json from the setup we just did. So I can check to see the contents of our package.json. This is what it looks like, right? We have the name, the version, a bunch of details in here. And of course, we can simply open this up in VS Code already. Okay, so I think my picture is probably disturbing some of us. So let's take it off. Good. All right, so here we go. I have my application right here in Node, right here in VS Code. I'm going to change the theme. I think a couple of people would probably prefer light theme for our sessions, I believe. If you don't like this, let me know. But I think this is more visible if you ask me. Okay, so right now we have a simple environment here. So nothing is happening here. We need to set up uh, Express. In the last session, you also learned a couple of things around working with Express. So this is quite, plain. You can say node server.js and we'll just have hello world. So there's nothing going on here for now. So it's time to set up a server using Express.js. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. And I mentioned that I created a material earlier. So I have that material here. I'll share this with you. I call it Backend Engineering 101, with, very simple set of examples. I just put this together, asking ChatGPT to give me a couple of sample code I can share with you. So yes, I would explain, the code. The point is you can simply grab some of these stuff from the Express documentation as well. Express.js documentation will probably be the best place to learn Express.js from, not some random YouTube video, right? Trust me, it's actually very good to learn from the documentation. You see exactly how to install Express and, of course, how to use Express. When you check the guide, you see we have different sections here from routing, writing middleware and using middleware, using template engines, error handling, debugging, and, of course, database integrations as well. So by simply copying this code, this would allow you install Express.js in your environment. So if I proceed to run this code, it is going to install Express.js, and of course, you can find that installation, package once the installation is done, right? So let's just give it a few seconds, and we'll get to see that we have a new dependency. When you install packages in your application, we call them dependencies, and it would also appear right here in the package.json, right? So now you see we have a dependency, Express, right? This just appeared after we have installed Express.js, okay? Make sure that your installation is happening inside the same directory, right? Some people make the mistake of getting to install outside of the directory. You would get an error because you probably don't have a Node.js environment initialized on that path. So you want to make sure you are inside that directory. So right now you can see we have what we also call node modules, right? Node modules is where you have the packages that you have installed in your environment. This is our environment. When we install a new package, yeah, most likely that package comes with a ton of other packages, and everything will be added into node modules, right? So that when you come back to your application, you can simply run your application, without necessarily having to install those packages again. But say you mistakenly delete these node modules, or you no longer need it and you take it off. When you want to come back to this, all you have to do is run npm install or npm I, which is a short form of having install, because you already have this written inside the package.json as a dependency. That particular package will be installed alongside any other package that you have within the dependency block here. All right. So you see, we have that package installed again, and we did not specify this time around that we wanted to install Express again. All right, awesome. So now that we have Express installed, the next thing we want to do is to simply set up, our block of code, right? We call these, our controllers. Let's click on next. So you see, we have the first sample code here. If I should drop this code here, let's reduce this a bit. Okay, so the first thing we see happen here is we import Express. Remember, when you are importing packages, using CommonJS, this is basically how you do it. It can be const, it can be let, right? It can be var, but yeah, let's stick to const. So you have Express, and then you say equals require, right? And then the name of the package, right? Which is exactly what we have down here. Okay, so let's take this off. That is how you import your package. After importing your package, you want to initialize, your Express. You want to initialize Express basically. So you see what we did here. We call this Express. I can call this Mav, right? And you see I can also use it this way. But yeah, it makes sense that you basically get the exact item. This is an alias, right? So you basically get the exact. You use the name. It makes more sense, and developers will be very familiar with this, of course. Okay, so when we say const app equals express, we also specify the ports. Your applications are meant to run on specific ports, and maybe I can also explain this right here. We have this application running, and of course, you don't see the ports, but every application, every URL or domain name you see out there, you can always, probably trace the IP, right? Ideally, if you don't have a domain name, then you are supposed to see something like, let's just say 101.192 point 10 or point 19.10. This is just an example, probably not a valid URL. And this would have a port, right? If you are running on port 80, if you're running on port 80, then this is probably just HTTP, right? And then it means you're probably serving this with, of course, you would always serve this with some engine. So I would give an example, Nginx. We'll get to talk about this later, right? But we have, engines that you can use to run your applications. This is a reverse proxy, basically. We'll get to talk about this in the future. But now the point is this is running on port 80. Um, so you see, this is on HTTP. The moment you are running on HTTPS, then this is running on port 443. When you have a domain name assigned to this, you don't need to include the ports or the IP or the port numbers. You don't need to include that at all. So let's change this back to 300devdays.com. I think that was API dots. Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is what we have. Let's go back. This is what we're working with for now, and this is currently on our local machine. So when you run the code app.listen, you are launching your application, and you specify the port. This port is going to be 3,000. It can be 5,000. It can be whatever you choose to use at this point, right? Let's just whatever port is open, right, and usable. So let's just stick to 3,000 for now. So this is basically the base route. As you can see, I have that verb I mentioned earlier. We have .get. It can be .post. It can be .put, right? It can be .delete, right? It can be, .patch, as you can see, right? But for now, let's just stick to .get. We're trying to get, a response when we visit this URL right here, okay? What I am going to do is I will run this. So you can simply say node server.js. As you can see, this is currently running. It's telling us that our example app is listening on this port. It's currently running, okay? So from my terminal, I can simply say call localhost 3000 slash, and yes, I get hello world, right? That is the base. I get hello world, okay? So someone is asking for a live project in place of the port. Are we to add the URL of the website? No. So for a live project, you are still going to maintain, the ports and the local hosting. What you do is when you have deployed this on a server, right? So you have a server running somewhere. Let's assume you have a server running on AWS, right? Just an example, okay? So when you have that server running on AWS, what you're probably going to do is so this is what's it called, a VPS, right? or let's just call it a machine, a virtual machine. So you basically inside that virtual machine, you install what we call Nginx. This is the example I'm giving for now. We're using Nginx because it's actually very popular for this use case. So when you have installed Nginx, you have your application. Let's say this is your application running here on local host spot 3000. What you're going to do is to use nginx, which is the reverse proxy, right? You configure nginx to say whatever is running on this particular port, I want it to connect to API dot 300 devdays.com. And of course, we'll show you how to do that. Not immediately, but with time, right? We'll get there. So you configure nginx to run this way, and you would say nginx, please, whatever I have that is on this port, I want you to, when somebody visits the IP of this box, which is already tied to the domain name right here, I simply want you to, return whatever is running on port 3000 on the base, yeah, so we'll call it reverse proxy, right? So reverse that, traffic running on local host 3000, reverse it to just run on port 80. Port 80 is going to be that default name, which is this, right? So this is port 80. When you run this, you don't need to put the port on your browser. It will just work, right? Because the browser understands that you are simply trying to run this as a domain name that is not having that SSL security, right? So I just want to run this on port 80. When somebody visits this domain name, which is this IP, route that particular request, whether it says slash hello, for example, route that request to point to the base IP or this domain name slash hello, right? So that is what happens. But this is still exactly how you would run it with the same port 3000 or any other port, right? You just have to specify within your reverse proxy. This is, reverse proxy server. So we basically set up that configuration within Nginx to do the routing to the specific, endpoints, okay? And you no longer need to specify the 80. But just to show you an example, if I go back to express.js, for example, and I simply say, get me port 80. Now, the thing is, um, hold on, let me see. Probably not doing it. Oh yeah, SSL. Okay, I think I almost forgot. We are currently on SSL. So when I put 80 right now, if you notice that error, why are we trying to run this on port 80 when we are using XSL already, right? If I change this to 443, you see it automatically reverts to the default domain name, 44. Yeah, is that what I entered now? Let's see. Yeah, 443. So when I point to 443, it routes me back, right? If I get a particular domain name that doesn't have SSL and I put 80, it will definitely work, okay? But the point is, the browser is smart enough to understand that, we don't need to show the number. Of course, we know where we are heading to, and it just returns the whole thing back to the, default port, the default domain name without, showing the port. But as you can see, you can try it on your end. It reverses, back, right? And of course, this would, happen on different websites like this. So you see, it takes you back, right? I hope that makes sense, Oluwafemi. All right, so let's go back to what we were looking at, the Hello World example. And back in our VS Code, you see, when I say slash, it gets me that Hello World. If I should change this to like, name, right? I'm simply going to say hello user, for example. Let's stop this and let's run it again. You have to stop it and run it again because you are not using an application that makes it, that gives you hot reload and all that. So yes, if I should run this one more time, now you see I have an error because that part doesn't exist, right? That slash part, just like this doesn't exist anymore, right? So I have to say slash name and I get hello user, okay? And of course, you can have multiple of this. So I can have slash, yeah, let's just keep it this way. And I'll simply say, this is the base route. I can just say, let's add some emojis here, for fun. Let's just add one more. Okay. All right. So if I should save this, let's stop, run again, run this. So now I still have hello user. If I come back here, I have this is the base route. Okay. So as you can see, we are still running the get example, right? Let's try to do something, a bit more practical. You can follow through the you can follow through this tutorial. You see, we have an express generator, that will basically walk you through generating your Express.js application, right? But we don't need to use this for now. It simply shows us a couple of patterns that we can use when running our application, right? You can set, debug parameters um, in your terminal, and it also shows you, a good way, a good structure when you are trying to generate your project, right? A good way to arrange a project. You see, we have routes, we have views, we have public. If you want to expose some things to the public, we have the app.js, we have bin, and yeah, you can choose to have a better structure than this one, but this is pretty good at least for a start. I will show you how I, get to arrange my application. What I start off with would be SRC, which is the source folder, and within that source folder, I mean, sometimes it can even be API, right? For me, okay. So just understand that the structure would eventually be based on how you enjoy working with your team. That does not mean you do something that is terrible if you're working alone, right? So if I call this, SRC, for example, in here I can have a folder I call modules. If I want to have a modularized, like structure, I can actually go this route. But let's just start with the regular, model view. Okay. So yeah, it can be views, models, and then controller. So inside the controllers, I can simply have maybe my code, my controller code. Inside the model, I can also have my auth. I can call this auth model. I can call this auth controller, for yeah, and I can call this my auth view, right? So at the end of the day, it depends on how you prefer to structure your code. For most people that love the MVC style, model view controller, you probably find them using this, right? And most people would just prefer to even put this in the root without having the source, which is also fine, right? I personally don't like this approach, even though it is perfect, following industry standard as well. I just love to have a way to modularize my code, right? So I can have modules, and outside of that, I can choose to have maybe some middleware, right, and some other things within the module. I can simply have yeah, within the module I can simply have my auth module, and probably some other module like profiles, right, or preference or settings, whatever it is, right. And in here, I know I have my controller, I have my model, and I also have my routes. Okay, so the reason why I love this is because I can choose to switch on modules or switch it off if I want to. I can choose to, yeah, I can choose to, use this module when I want to, and I can also choose to delete this module entirely, and it will not affect any bit of my code. All I have to do is probably take off one line from my main server.js file. You'll get to see me use this, sample later on, but for now, let's just take it off, and let's stick to working with a single file. All right. So yeah, what I'm going to do right now is to walk us through, how we will set up a very simple application. Let's just do that for like 5 minutes. Yeah, 5 to 10 minutes probably before we end the session because of time. All right. So yes, let's start off by creating more endpoints. So I have the get endpoints. I have the post endpoints, right? And I'm simply going to say this endpoint will be used for posting records. Okay, so of course I can have the others delete, put, patch, and the rest, but we don't need to do that. Given the two examples I have, I think one thing you need to understand is the ROEQ and the ROES object. It can be full, it can be request, it can be response. I mean, it depends, right? Keeping it short this way is also good because the industry is also very familiar with this pattern. Of course, you saw that in the documentation as well. So sometimes it's good to keep up with the industry standard, right? So that people that are already using Express would also understand what you're trying to achieve. Let's try to see, the content. By the way, this is the path, right? Or what I am referring to as the route. Okay. Depending on how you choose to structure your project, you can structure it in such a way that this would be recorded separately, right, in a different file, and the action is also separate in a different file. Okay. For now, everything is just put together. So let's try to console.table request. I want you to see what this would look like. So if I should run this again and I go back to the terminal here, let's just run this. Let's come back here. Basically, I have a bunch of things here. I don't think this was the best option for putting it in a tabular form. Let's just log it instead. We have a bunch of records in there. By the way, if you don't want to always stop the server and start the server again, you can choose to install what we call nodemon, right? Nodemon, I simply have to say npm install -g. Let's install that globally, Nodemon. So I already have this installed, by the way, but Nodemon is going to be a good way to run your application while you are developing. So you don't have to start and stop, all the time. Um, you can simply run this with Nodemon, and when you make any change, it is triggered automatically, right? If I make a change here by saying this is the home route and I save, it restarts automatically, right? So as you can see, this is the home route. If I make another change, base, save, that is triggered automatically as well, base. All right, now you can see all the items we have, within that get request, right? The request object. It has a lot of things here, right? And of course, you get to see like the path name. So if I simply say path name is hello world, for example, and I run hello world, you see, let's look at what the object looks like. So let's scroll down towards the end. Of course, you start by saying that this is the path name, this is the route object, the path name, the stack, the method that we just ran, which is get, right? And of course, a bunch of other things, the user agents, and yeah, so many things you would eventually get to use. So, for example, if we're on the post end, we can simply say post to submit, and if we simply, visit that post/submit end, you will be able to get some additional info. So let's assume I say console.log request.body. Request.body is going to give me the body object, but sometimes, I mean, now we're just starting this. So if you look at right here, we did not set up a way to basically get JSON objects. Let's take a look at what happens when I run our application. So let's go to Postman to make a post request, and I would simply say localhost 3000 slash submit. This is a post. So in the body, I can set raw, give me, the user name, for example, and I say my username is Mav Magic, okay? And for the password, I say I have a password of 12345. Okay, so let's send this. If I should send this to slash submit, it says cannot post slash submit. Let's figure out why it cannot post. Oh yeah, there's a spelling error there, submit. Let's run that again. So now you see this endpoint will be used for submitting records, which was exactly what we returned. This endpoint will be used for submitting record. Now let's look at the body that was returned, right? That was logged. We said console.log request.body. You see that it could not find the request.body because we need to first say um, app.use, and we will say express.json, right? So when we call this express.json and we run that query again to the backend, now we are able to see we have the endpoint to be used for posting records. Let's go back, and now we are able to see the object that was sent to the backend, the username and the password. And of course, we can access that if we want to. So let's say let username equals request.username, and let password equals requests dot password, right? Of course, you can simply just say let username and password equals request.body, right? Which is req.body. So this actually does the job perfectly as well, if that is what you prefer to do. And you can simply log username and password. Okay, so let's just have a little bit of description here. So I'm simply going to put this Okay, so this is the password. All right, so I will say our username is, and our password is. Okay, so if I save this, go back to Postman, I run this again, see we have our username is magic and our password is this, right? And I can choose to respond with a JSON this time around. So let's just respond to JSON, and I will simply say message. Let's start with status true, right? Yeah, and I'll simply say message. I'll say sign up was successful. As you can see, this is an object. So if I save this, go back to the browser, go back to Postman, and I run this, you see what I get, right? Let's go back to Pretty. So you see, this is what I get, and this is that status. I did not specify the status, by the way, so I can do that by saying the status, and I specify 200, right? So now I get that specific status of 200. By default, I already have 200, which is okay. And if I change this to 201, because I'm trying to create a record, if I should run this now, you'll see that I get 201 here that says created, right? If I should change this to maybe 301, I mean, you don't need to use the wrong status code, obviously, but you get the point. You can also change that accordingly, and that will be reflected on the response you get. Now we've taken 6 minutes of your time, extra time. Apologies for that. So I'm going to stop here. We'll continue from here tomorrow, and we'll speak to performing actual actions using databases. We'll talk about the foundational knowledge you need to understand when it comes to database, right? We're going to be looking at MongoDB specifically for a start, and later on we'll definitely get to explore relational databases as well, like Postgres. So have a wonderful night, guys. And if you have more questions, please do well to drop those questions in the WhatsApp group or the Discord server, and I'll be there to respond to you. Let me give you additional 3 minutes to drop your questions, and maybe I can take them, right? But if you don't have any question, I will attend to you guys on WhatsApp or Discord. Thank you.